Hello everyone, I'm Sahid. Thank you for clicking this video. I am very happy that you're here. Today I'll be continuing my chapter series on Blessings by Chukwuebuka ibeh, and today we'll be reading part 2, chapter 9. So for the past few days now I've been reading this book and it's just been really impactful to me personally because this book so far has just really told my story, and this is something I always look forward to in literature. So it tells the Nigerian story, the queer story, the family dynamic story, the trying to sort of find one's sort of identity and knowing who you truly are. So all these things really just as truly connected to me, and I've really connected to some of the main characters, specifically Obi Funna, and I continue to read this book. It's just really moving for me. But like my other videos, if you haven't watched, please make sure to watch those videos as they give you just a bit more idea of sort of how we got to the point in which we'll be reading about today. And before I do today's reading, like my other videos, I like to give sort of a recap of what I read in the previous chapter. So in the previous chapter, we sort of are in Obi Funa's boarding school, and we first experience, this time during around Christmas, when Obi Funa was about to sort of go on Christmas break, and then he sort of during Christmas break, which is when the students go back home to their relatives, have a good time during the holiday season with their families. But unfortunately, Obi Funa wasn't able to go back home to Port Harcourt. Instead, his dad sort of insisted that he would go stay with his aunt, who lived in Owerri, which is where his boarding school is located. And so he goes to this aunt's place, who I think he sort of grew up knowing her, obviously because she's his aunt. But when he gets there, his sort of perspectives of what he was expecting, was different, and she was actually much, sort of nicer in a way to him, and he had a bit more freedom living with his aunt, and he was able to watch TV and all these things. And she also fed him. She had a house help who made sure that Obi Funa would eat constantly, and she herself found as though it was important to do that because it was her way of helping him gain weight before he goes back to school. Within the 2 weeks he's gonna be with her due to the fact that he lost so much weight within the span of the months that he was at boarding school. And so later on he ends up leaving his aunt's house and to go back to school. And when he goes back to school, it's around the time that also it's around, I guess, springtime, where seniors also will be graduating soon, so they're having a lot of exams. And if you know from our previous chapter videos that we sort of explore this sort of relationship between Obi Funa and a senior in his boarding school that's in SS3 called Senior Papilo. He's this sort of football player. He's kind of popular. He's known for all his sort of mean things and sort of very egoistic attitude, and how he's very controlling. He often gives punishments to students in his school, and I personally don't like him. But anyways, in chapter 8, we sort of explore how Senior Papilo and Obi Funa go out of town, and Senior Papilo sort of pushes him to do something disgusting. And when I was reading, I was so disgusted. But basically, what Obi Funa, sort of did, obviously influenced by Senior Papilo, was that he had sex for the first time, and it was with an older woman, somebody who I just can't believe, he, a 16-year-old, had to do that. And at first, the girl was sort of like, he looks young, I don't, how would I be? And they're speaking in pidgin, by the way, and so they're saying things in a slightly different way. And I did read it with pidgin. in my previous chapter video, so please watch that one. But yeah, so basically, there was this lady called Angel who I believe um, Senior Papillo knew prior, because he would often, whenever he said he was going out of town or to town, it was to do these discussing themes. And we see that that's not only the discussing theme he does. So after he leading him to Obi finna to do this discussing thing with this lady and having sex with her, and literally he, between how many minutes of him doing it, he literally released, and it was just really sad seeing that, because it was his first time. And this is somebody who is still figuring out his sexuality. He, based on what we read so far, we know that he's attracted to a boy, a character in the book named A Boy. He's attracted to that character, and so reading that scene and seeing how now he's sort of like forced to do this thing, and he's scared that if he says no, Snake Papillo will sort of abuse him, punish him for agreeing and then saying no. And he hates liars. Snake Papillo is very strong on people who lie, and he sort of was afraid that if he made excuses, he would have consequences for that. So he ends up doing it, and then after that, he still surrounds himself with Senior Papillo, and they also go out of town again. And this time, when they go out of town, they go to this girls' secondary school that's sort of near to their boys' secondary school. And in this all-girls secondary school, when they get there, they sort of, not they, but specifically Senior Papillo, because he was obviously the one who was leading the whole adventure, and Obifina was just following him. But Senior Papillo, when he got there, he told the gate man at the all-girls senior school compound that he was here to see his sister. But though we come to find out that it was not in fact his sister, it was somebody he was seeing, and I guess his girlfriend or something, or a girl who he possibly was having an intimate relationship with. But anyways, after giving this sort of false name and false identity, the gate man, after sort of saying that do you know how many trouble I'm going to get into this, but they later bribed him, and he let them in. And after they let Saint Papillo and Obifina went in, they meet up with this girl who brings this additional sort of school daughter, and that's what Saint Papillo called her. And the girl name is Rachel, and then the actual sort of older girl name is Munachiso. So Munachiso brings this girl with her, and Saint Papillo's doing something he has done before, which is pushing Obifina to do something he doesn't want to do. Obifina is sort of like starstruck, and he doesn't really know what to do in this situation, because he has never had an intimate moment with a girl. Maybe a boy, yes, but not a girl. And so it was really too awkward. And then Saint Papillo was like, this is your girl, like, aren't you going to make the move? And just throughout that chapter, I was disturbed in several aspects, especially this part where we sort of have Saint Papillo and Obifina's relationship, and sort of the thing that they go to do. And it's just, that's sort of how it concluded. But I wanted to keep it as short as possible, so I could get into today's reading on chapter 9. But once again, I'm very happy that you're here. Please, I will kindly appreciate that you watched the previous chapter videos before you watch this reading I'm about to do. But yes, I hope you continue to support, and I hope you subscribe, like, and comment. Okay. Part 2, Chapter 9. Something about the face feels familiar to Uzumaka. It is perhaps the state of the head, oblong, shaped and closely shaved, now twisted to an unnatural angle so that it faces upwards, even though the body is essentially lying on its stomach, usually splayed on the pavement. His hands have been folded behind him as though in cuffs, a captive, even in debt. His open mouth emits a whitish tongue. All around him, flies are having a feast, but it is the eyes that Uzumaka is unable to handle, open, staring up at the sky, as if in supplication. None of the people who have formed a mini-circle around the corpse to snap their fingers and speculate on his identity and cause of death step forward to close those eyes. It is a bad omen in Uzumaka's hometown to die with one's eyes open like that. The spirit will never rest, and when you think of the boy who cannot be more than 16, essentially a child who ought to be bringing succor to his mother or irritating her to an end, not splayed on the floor like a rag doll beneath a blistering sun, with his eyes open like that. Uzuamaka is deeply unsettled by those eyes, and so Uzuamaka is not entirely surprised or alarmed when she sees the boy flashing before her vision throughout the day. It is those eyes that crystallize in her mind, seeming to tell her something she cannot comprehend. The next time she sees the body again, it is in a slightly adjusted position, the head now positioned naturally, but most importantly, the eyes are closed. Because of the gentleness now on the face with the eyes closed, making it almost ethereal, Uzuamaka cannot help but stare. She's aware that she cuts a curious spectacle, standing there alone in the hot sun to mope around the body, and yet is unable to look away. She's unable, too, to stop herself from inching close to the body, her steps deliberate and calculated, unable to stop the lurch in her art. The face is slightly shaded from her view, and she has to turn the head all the way to an unnatural angle, again to fully look at the face. The sun is at its highest point in the sky, and her skin is clinging to her blouse from the sweat. She's aware that all eyes are trained on her. Decisively, she flips the body over with considerable effort. How is he so heavy? And lifts the shirt up, and her eyes trailing over the body, willing it to become clearer, and at the same time remain obscure. Her hand feels the warmth of the bloated stomach before she sees the birthmark. Just as she remembers it, a splotchy, dark mark just above the pelvis. It is perhaps the only thing that has not changed, a defining feature that somehow remains unaltered. He looks so peaceful, almost happy in debt, she thinks, right before she clubs at him and screams. Through blurred vision, she sees people running towards her. They are tugging at her shoulders, trying to pull her away from him, but she's unable to tear her eyes away from that face, her hands from that body, unable to stop herself from saying his name. Ekene, 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 like a war chant. In the throng of the voices, she finally registers one that is familiar, and she turns to look up at ngozi. He is suddenly the only one present in a room that is dimly lit and deadly quiet, and he is glaring at her in confusion. What is wrong with you? He thunders in angry Igbo. You almost rose the whole street. Uzuamaka does not understand what he is talking about. She looks around her for Ekene, but she is surrounded by bed sheets, and so she leaps from the bed and hurries to the boy's room. She rushes up to Ekene's bed and shakes him vigorously until he stares and sits up in alarm. Behind her, Anazi's voice booms in her ears. There's so much going on that the only thing that feels sensible to do is to burst into tears, holding on to Ekene until dawn filters in through the window. Now Uzuamaka sighed. Below her, the woman whose hair she was braiding shot her an offended glance. Sorry, Uzuamaka said with a thin smile, repositioning the head. Her apprentices, two young girls taking advantage of the university strike to acquire a skill, exchange puzzled looks, no doubt confused as to why she, of all the people in the saloon, seemed most affected by the news of the shooting. "Splayed on the pavement just like that," the woman began again, snapping her fingers as if to reject the fate. It was she who had delivered the news of the shooting, having been, she claimed, at the location herself. She had about her none of the horror Uzumaka expected, only the vaguely exalted bearing of one wielding most sought after information. "Nawa," another woman said. She had her hair stuck in the hair dryer and spoke with her head unmoving, almost comical. "First we couldn't sleep for the cultist, now we can't sleep for the military." "But they said he was a suspect," one of the women said. "Which suspect?" the newsreader fired back. "He was only trying to answer a call." "But we don't know who exactly was calling." Uzumaka stifled another sigh. As much as she found herself drawn to conversation, she inwardly wished the woman would stop talking. How easily her day had gone from wonderful to horrendous. It was the anniversary of Obi Funa's birth. He had turned 17 that morning, and she had surprised him by calling to sing to him, just as she always did when he was home, carrying with her the delightful surprise in his voice all the way to the salon, only to be greeted by her apprentices with the news of the shooting. Now this loud-mouthed woman would not stop with the details. It had occurred at Ikyoku Junction, just walking distance from her shop. The cult clashes had reached their peak, random bodies piling up by the roadside, unclaimed. There were rumors swirling around that the cult groups were the products of seeds sown by politicians, and even the governor's name was mentioned once or twice. It was believed that the governor's own party had backed a section of the cult group the year before to rig the elections in his favor. On emerging the winner, he reneged on his promise to properly establish them, and so they took to the streets, causing unspeakable havoc with the same weapons the government had purchased for them. Uzumaka thought the story too conspiratorial to be accurate, but the brazeness of the cult groups made her wonder. She joined a peace demonstration by women in the neighborhood, marching through the market all the way to the government quarters, where they set up camp, singing and demanding action until police vans arrived and released tear gas to disperse the crowd. The governor's response after weeks of protest was to declare a state of emergency, officially handing over the state's security to the military. The men swooped in without warning, wielding guns almost half their size, wearing menacingly starched camouflage, and driving around town in shiny new vans with the warning inscription, "Operation Hesitate and Die." It was said that they walked around with their lips padlocked. Uzumaka had yet to see that, but nothing was impossible with these people, and hands positioned at the trigger, ready to fire at a moment's notice. They announced new security protocols over the radio, declared nightly curfews, carried out random stop, search exercises, and set up checkpoints at major junctions, where passers-by were required to walk with both hands raised, as if in surrender, not letting them down for any reason. Uzumaka had heard stories of how an elderly man had wet himself because he was pressed and had been too scared to put his hands down. Week after week, the governor gave satisfied broadcast over the radio extolling his own ingenuity in bringing about order, blithely unaware or choosing to overlook the eternal state of terror among his citizens. The most recent victim Uzoamaka gathered from the conversation was only a boy. His attention had slipped at the checkpoint when his phone rang, and he reached into his pocket for it. Perhaps it was a girlfriend calling, or his wife, or his mother. Perhaps it was the excitement that made him forget in that instant where he was, sensing too late, just when the bullets were pelting his skin, the ensuing chaos propelling him, exiting the world before he even touched the floor. Uzoamaka wondered if he had already taken the call before he was shot. What the person on the other end had made of the staccato shots sounding like fireworks in July, the whirl of screams, the buzzing of the phone line, the permanent silence that settled in. But we can't really blame the army, Sha. The newsreader conceded. She would not stop. Those Dimbam boys were a real terror. Everyone made variant sounds of agreement. Uzoamaka held the now finished hair together and reached for a candle to burn the tips. She would never understand how young boys woke up in the morning and decided of all things to become cultists, taking pleasure in hacking rival members to death in broad daylight from the sight of young bodies bloating in the sun. Until now, they had been everywhere, not even bothering to hide their identity, moving past her shop with the same lopsided walk that was their trademark, dragging a foot as if it were only loosely attached to their hip, one shoulder comically raised while the other inched to the side, almost like a deformity. They were even adorned in the same colors, bright red or yellow or black handkerchief tied to their wrist or around their necks or peeping from their back pockets. Once at the market, the woman who sold second-hand clothes had dissuaded her from buying a pair of red shorts she fancied for Ekene because red, according to the woman, was one of their colors, and Ekene might attract their attention if you were to fly their color. The woman had told her about her neighbor's son who had gone out wearing a pair of yellow shoes. For most of the night, his family's headstones rained down on their roof, which only stopped when the boy went out to meet them. He returned 2 days later with machete inflicted wounds on his back as proof of initiation. And now he stole money from street shops and openly fought his father. Uzoamaka wondered about Ekene. He was just 16, and she already found herself having to push back against early signs of rebellion, hating the note in her voice when she had to scream at him for keeping a late night, her absolute shock when she walked in on him one time smoking a cigarette in his room. It might have helped if Obifuna was around. He had always exerted a quietening influence on Ekene, supervising Ekene's activities out of Uzoamaka's sight. But he all but belonged to Ngozi's sister now, and Ekene had too much private time to himself, spent hours playing football in the field, kept company with people she knew next to nothing about. Once she saw him from the balcony shaking a neighbor's son and handing with a sign she did not understand. He was only a child, and the implications of what he was doing eluded him. Yet she waited until he had turned in for the night and then approached him with a cane. She flogged him repeatedly until they were both crying, she thinking all the while of that body splayed on the pavement, those vacant eyes boring into hers. Thinking, too, about how that death might have been averted if only the boy's mother had flogged him a little longer, a little harder. And that is the end of chapter 9. Let's talk about it. So in chapter 9, we sort of explore this sort of weird encounter early on, in which I was sort of afraid of where it was getting to. But basically, Uzumaka was having this dream, particularly due to, I guess, things that were. Excuse me, I just realized my light was not focused on me. But to continue, Uzumaka was experiencing these like different visions of what I thought was real at first. But it happens to seem that Uzumaka was dreaming, and when she sort of comes back to reality, she notices that Ngozi sort of looking at her in confusion, sort of asking her, what is wrong with you? You almost froze up the whole street because she was sort of yelling her son's name, her last-born Ekene's name, about 3 times in a very loud tone. After she wakes up, she quickly sort of rises and goes to Ekene's room and sort of hold his hand tight, sort of all emotional, and she starts to cry. And there was just so much going in the background with Anazi sort of I guess yelling at her, and so she sort of crying to her son Ekene. And then later on, we have this scene in which she's at the salon and she has a bunch of customers who she's doing their hair. And they have this moment in which they're talking about something that's been going on in their environment, and it was basically about how cultists have been sort of killing, young people, and even like just older people, just killing people in their community. And it was really sad reading that because the women were talking about it. And then we read about how Uzumaka went to protest and how she, realized the different, not realized, but heard about the different victims and just the different things the women were talking about while they were in the salon. And, reading that made me, think and worried because I'm pretty sure one of the reasons the author sort of included that sort of dream was because it was something that was prevalent in their community and has been happening for a while now. And so, Uzumaka starts to have a dream about these really horrendous situations that I think chukwuebuka ibeh just did such a wonderful job at being very descriptive with what she was seeing and what was happening in their community. And we read about how this is something that's even happening close to her shop, and how even these young cultists, who I guess happen to be young boys who just choose to become cultists, which, many of the women in the shop are like, why would they want to do that with their lives? And so, this is something that, as, Uzumaka, the mother of 2 sons, she wouldn't want that for her child, especially Ekene, knowing how he's just much different than Obifuna. And Obifuna is at boarding school, so obviously he wouldn't be doing this or sort of influenced to do something like this. But Ekene, her son, who's still living with them, could possibly be influenced by this. And so she, as she listens to these things, she doesn't really want to hear them because obviously it's horrifying, and this is something that she's going to have to ponder on and sort of think about, and hear just this terrible news that it's going to make her as a mother scared. And so she doesn't want to listen to that, but she knows it's something that is going on in their community, and deep down she has to know the news, and she has to be aware of the unfortunate things so she could protect her own family. And later on we have this sort of situation in which his mother was talking about, she feels as though Ekene has turned into this rebellious little boy, and she feels as though she has to say things to him more in a way that sort of she's trying to get him to listen, but he doesn't. And certain things he does, and the reason towards the end I think we read about how he was shaking at another neighbor's son, and she felt that it was weird. And so when he came back home, she sort of flogs him very well, because while in her mind she felt as though this was one way to discipline him and make sure that he wouldn't be influenced and goes on to do really these horrible things, or be put in situations that could possibly get him killed, or get him to become one of these cultists. And so as she was beating him, what was included towards the end was that she was also crying because she felt as though just maybe if the boy in the community, the young boy who recently died, if his mother had maybe flogged him a bit more, what happened would have not happened. And so that was included towards the end. And she felt that those flogging Ekene was one way to make sure he doesn't make the wrong decision and do the right things. And so yeah, that's sort of how chapter 9 ends. And so that's sort of my recap of what I've read. I tried to keep this as short as possible, as the video might be a bit long. And yeah, I really appreciate you for watching. Thank you for your continued support. If you enjoyed this video, please kindly subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Bye.